I had always heard stories about haunted hotels, but I never thought I'd experience anything remotely paranormal. Until one business trip changed that. It was about 5 years ago, and I had been traveling across the country for work. Late flights and long days had become the norm, and I was used to staying in all kinds of hotels. They all blurred together after a while. Same decor, same beds, same sterile atmosphere. But this one hotel was different. It was an old historic building that had been converted into a boutique hotel. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it had that eerie, old-world charm. The kind of place that made you feel like you'd stepped back in time. I checked in late one evening after a full day of meetings, and the lobby was almost empty, except for the night clerk. "Here's your key," the clerk said, handing me an actual brass key on a keychain. "Room 303. I thanked him and took the rickety elevator up to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper and creaky floorboards. As I walked toward my room, I noticed something odd. The door to room 305 was slightly ajar, and the light inside was flickering. I hesitated for a moment, but figured it was just a guest who had forgotten to shut the door properly. I moved on and unlocked my own room, eager to get some rest. As soon as I walked into room 303, I felt it, the cold. The room was freezing. It felt like someone had left the AC on full blast all day. I walked over to the thermostat and saw it was set to 60 degrees. Shivering, I turned it off and cranked the heat up as high as it would go. I figured the old system just needed time to warm up, so I settled into bed, hoping the room would heat up soon. But it didn't. No matter how long I waited, the temperature stayed icy cold. I pulled the heavy comforter around me, trying to ignore the chill, but something about it didn't sit right. The room felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling, turning on the TV to distract myself. It worked for a while, but then strange things started happening. I heard a soft tapping noise coming from the window, like someone gently knocking on the glass. When I looked, the window was closed and locked. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind, but the sound wouldn't stop. Then, the light on the bedside table flickered, just like I'd seen in the hallway. I was starting to feel uneasy. I reached for my phone to check the time, thinking maybe I'd just sleep through the night and leave first thing in the morning. That's when I saw the time on the clock. 3:03 a.m. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the room itself. The numbers glowed in the darkness, the room number and the time matching perfectly. Something about it felt ominous, like a warning. Suddenly, I felt a pressure on my chest, like an invisible weight pushing me down. I tried to move, but my body was frozen in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. It was as if something was holding me down, keeping me trapped. My heart pounded in my ears as panic set in. I stared at the clock, and as the seconds slowly ticked by, the weight on my chest grew heavier. My vision blurred, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the clock struck 3:04. Instantly, the pressure lifted. I gasped for air, sitting up in bed, my entire body shaking. I didn't know what had just happened, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, fully dressed, waiting for daylight. By the time the sun came up, I had packed my bags and was ready to get out of there. I went downstairs to check out, still rattled by the night's events. The morning clerk was friendlier than the one from the night before, asking me how my stay had been. I hesitated before answering. "Is there anything strange about room 303? The clerk's smile faded. She lowered her voice, glancing around as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. You're not the first guest to ask that. This building used to be a psych ward back in the early 1900s. There are rumors it's one of the most haunted places in the country. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I hadn't believed in ghosts before, but after last night, I wasn't so sure. I handed the clerk my key and left without another word. That was the last time I ever stayed at a non-chain hotel. No more boutique charm, no more historic buildings. I'll take sterile and boring over haunted any day. There's always been a local legend about a tunnel, hidden away on a windy back road near where I grew up. It wasn't just any tunnel. It was the kind of place that had stories attached to it. The rumor was that if you went there during the witching hour, between 2 and 3 a.m., you might encounter something far worse than just a cold draft or eerie silence. Some said it was a phantom, an aggressive and malevolent spirit that haunted the tunnel after a brutal accident decades ago. As teenagers, we'd all heard the story, but none of us ever had the guts to actually go there in the middle of the night. Until one summer night, when a group of my friends and I thought it would be fun to check it out. It was me, my friend Josh, his girlfriend Liz, and my best friend Mike. We were bored, it was late, and someone brought up the idea. At first, we all laughed it off, but as the night wore on, the idea started to sound more appealing. After all, it was just a tunnel, right? What was the worst that could happen? So, around 1:30 a.m., we all piled into Josh's car and headed down the winding, desolate road. The further we drove, the quieter everything became. The streetlights disappeared, and soon we were surrounded by thick woods on both sides. Even the moon seemed to fade, swallowed by the dark canopy of trees overhead. By the time we reached the tunnel, it was about 2:10 a.m. The place was completely isolated, miles from any town. The tunnel itself looked ancient, covered in graffiti and moss, its dark entrance looming like an open mouth. Josh drove us into the tunnel, and the car's headlights barely cut through the darkness as we rolled to a stop in the middle. The silence inside the tunnel was deafening. No one said a word as Josh killed the engine. We all sat there for a moment, listening to the stillness around us. It felt like the air was pressing down on us. "Well, we're here," Mike said, trying to sound casual, but his voice wavered. We grabbed our flashlights and got out of the car. The sound of our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the tunnel. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, making everything feel smaller, more claustrophobic. The air inside was damp and cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. "Is anyone else freaked out? Or is it just me?" Liz whispered, clutching Josh's arm. Before anyone could answer, we heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, like they were far off in the tunnel. But they weren't like ours. They were heavier, deliberate, almost like someone was marching toward us. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Maybe someone else is messing with us," Josh said, his voice shaky. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. Back in the car, I whispered, my heart pounding. We scrambled back to the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. Josh tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. "Come on," he muttered, turning the key again. Nothing. The footsteps kept coming, echoing through the tunnel, like they were right outside the car. Panic set in as Josh frantically tried to start the car again, but it was no use. That's when the weird stuff started happening. The radio turned on by itself, blasting static at full volume. The car lights flickered on and off, like something was playing with them. The dashboard lit up and then died. It felt like the car had a mind of its own, and we were trapped inside it. Liz screamed as the windshield wipers suddenly started moving, scraping across the glass even though it wasn't raining. The car was completely out of control, and no matter what Josh did, nothing stopped it. I sat there, gripping the seat, feeling helpless. The footsteps had stopped, but the air inside the car felt suffocating, like something was inside with us, watching us. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. The radio went silent, the lights stopped flickering, and the car returned to an eerie stillness. The silence was almost worse than the chaos that had just happened. For a moment, none of us moved, too terrified to even breathe. "Try it again," Mike whispered. Josh turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, he floored it, speeding out of the tunnel as fast as the car would go. None of us looked back. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town, under the safety of the streetlights. The tension in the car was thick, but no one said a word. We all knew what we had experienced wasn't normal. There was something in that tunnel, something that wanted us out. I've never been one for ghost stories. My life has always been rooted in reality, work, family, and the day-to-day grind. But something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain, no matter how many times I replay it in my head. It's the kind of thing that shakes your sense of what's real and what isn't. It all started when my father passed away. He had been gone for about 6 months, and I'd made it a routine to visit his grave every Sunday afternoon. I'd bring some flowers, sit by the headstone, and talk to him like I used to when he was alive. It was a way to feel close to him, even though he wasn't there anymore. One Sunday, I arrived at the cemetery a little later than usual. The sky was overcast, and there was a chill in the air that made the whole place feel even more somber. As I walked toward my father's grave, I noticed an older woman standing a few rows away. She looked lost, confused, like she didn't quite know where she was. I didn't think much of it at first. Cemeteries can be overwhelming, especially if you haven't been in a while. But as I got closer, she called out to me. "Excuse me, young man," she said in a soft, trembling voice. "Can you help me?" I stopped and turned to face her. She looked to be in her late 70s, wearing a long black coat and a simple hat. Her eyes were kind but tired, and there was a deep sadness in her expression. "Of course," I replied, walking over. "What do you need?" "I'm looking for my husband's grave," she said, wringing her hands nervously. "His name is Oliver Dawson. I've been here many times before, but I just can't seem to remember where it is." I nodded, thinking it was a simple enough request. Cemeteries can be confusing, especially the older sections where the headstones are worn and weathered. I asked her name, and she told me it was Lucille Dawson. "Let's see if we can find it," I said, and we began walking through the rows of graves together. As we walked, Lucille told me about her husband. Oliver had passed away years ago, but she still came to visit him often. They had been married for over 50 years, she said, and he had been the love of her life. I shared a bit about my own father, how much I missed him, and how visiting his grave brought me some comfort. We wandered for a while, with Lucille pointing out a few markers she thought looked familiar, but none of them were her husband's. After what felt like a good 20 minutes of searching, we finally found it. Oliver Dawson's grave, tucked away in a quiet corner of the cemetery. "Here it is," I said, bending down to brush some dirt and leaves off the headstone. The letters were faded, but I could still make out his name, Oliver Dawson. I turned to tell Lucille we had found it, but when I looked behind me, she was gone. At first, I thought maybe she had wandered off again, but I hadn't heard her leave. I called out her name. Lucille? No answer. I walked around the nearby graves, looking for her, but she was nowhere to be found. My heart started to race. It didn't make sense. She had been standing right behind me just a moment ago. How could she disappear like that? A strange feeling came over me, like something wasn't quite right. I turned back to the grave and knelt down again, brushing more dirt off the headstone. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, right next to Oliver's name, was another inscription. I wiped away more dirt, revealing the full name. Lucille Dawson. Below her name were her birth and death dates. She had passed away nearly 10 years ago. I stared at the headstone in disbelief. Lucille Dawson had been dead for a decade, and yet I had just spoken to her. I had walked through the cemetery with her. She had told me about her husband, and I had helped her find his grave. But she was already buried there, right next to him. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I called out her name one more time, but I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. I left the cemetery that day shaken, unable to explain what I had experienced. I still visit my father's grave, but I've never seen Lucille again. I often wonder if she was simply looking for someone to help her find her way back to her husband one last time. And now, every time I walk past their graves, I feel a strange sense of peace and a reminder that not all goodbyes are final. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be reminded when we post a new video every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email it to us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story featured in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.